Hold on here. I got it.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the Washington Outsider with you. Today is the host, that's me, Rina Zuckerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, and our special guest today is John Rosamando, a national security analyst, to discuss his recent investigation for Newsmax, focusing on the mysterious connections between Putin, Stasi, the East German intelligence agency that was linked to the communists in the Soviet Union, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the fracking groups in the US, and Joe Biden's energy policies, in particular the Keystone pipe disaster and the Green New Deal. John, welcome back. And how did this incredible investigation start to begin with? What made you even look in that direction?
Well, last year I was commissioned to do a report on the Democratic Socialists of America, and I ended up stumbling on the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation because I kept on seeing references, and then I started doing a deep dive into the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation because it was created by the East German communists after the fall of the Berlin Wall and before the reunification of Germany. And like last evening, I found a Russian language article in which the people representing the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Moscow were talking about how their mission is to present Russian ideas and be pro-Russian in Germany and in German society. And a lot of these people who run the foundation either were East German government figures, or they were Stasi informants or policy figures. A major person in the organization is the last East German premier, Hans Madro.
So tell us about the significance of that name. Why Rosa Luxemburg, and how did that foundation end up having an affiliation with the United States if it was an East German project?
Well, Rosa Luxemburg was a German communist figure in the early 20th century. Unlike Vladimir Lenin, she focused more on the quote unquote liberation of people of color, women, and so forth. And she was sort of like the great grandmother of modern woke neo-Marxism. How the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation seems to have followed the trajectory of East Germany's former external intelligence agency, the HVA, and it established an office in New York City in 2012 that was inaugurated by a guy by the name of Gregor Gysi, who was the head of the East German Communist Party after the fall of the wall. And he also worked with the Soviets and later the Russians to try to get Helmut Kohl to keep the Stasi archive from being released because it would be damaging to both.
Now it's interesting because the Soviet Union projected all these supposedly great ideas that were adopted by leftists in Western countries, racial equality, environmental concerns, assorted other, seemingly progressive ideas, but in reality, in the environment in the Soviet Union proper was disastrously handled, and it was one of the most racist and discriminatory countries that's ever existed, where ethnic identities of the citizens were actually shared in the passports of the infamous fifth paragraph. So for all this discussion about equality and these woke ideas, the roots of these ideas in the West were actually exactly the opposite. Now it's funny that the Stasi has had this link to this environmental movement. They themselves were known for their complete brutality, and we also know that in Germany in the 80s there was a series of terrorist attacks associated with climate extremism and environmental activists. Could you tell us what was all that about, and how did how did that particular group become affiliated with that specific Soviet idea?
Well, you need to look at, say, Vladimir Putin, who oversaw the Stasi operations in Dresden, where Madro was the party boss at the time. Some of the more recently released information shows that Putin oversaw the Red Army faction, which was a precursor of Antifa and also neo-Nazi skinheads. Their whole purpose was to destabilize West Germany and destabilize the West. So they would get themselves involved with everything that they thought could help to destabilize the West. And the West German, East German external intelligence, the HVIA, was particularly adept at camouflaging its activities by bringing people from the East and giving them false identities and so forth.
Now, before we get more into that, you just mentioned something that deserves far more attention, which is that this was a precursor to both the neo-Nazis and to Antifa, which calls itself an anti-fascist movement, literally fighting people like neo-Nazis. And woke activists in the US will have you believe that neo-Nazis are a right-wing movement that is the greatest danger to US security, domestic terrorists, and so forth. But it sounds like it's flip sides of literally the same coins going back to leftist activists. How do you explain that?
Well, if you look at the history of the development of socialism, you had different theories of socialism. Karl Marx was not the only game in town. You had other theorists in Germany who saw the idea of collectivism, the worship of the state, and they've decided to focus on the nation as opposed to international socialism of the sort promoted by the Marxist Leninists. But the Marxist Leninists weren't above supporting the Nazis in areas they controlled in order to divide and conquer.
We've seen how that played out with the attempted Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement and the attempt to divide Poland. But on moving away from the strictly geopolitical, realpolitik divisions and into ideological roots of it, National Socialists claimed to be doing what they were doing for the sake of their specific nations, whereas international socialists wanted to export the revolution to the rest of the world, but both of them ultimately operated by the same economic and ideological principles, or lack of principle, are focused entirely on power and control. And all of these movements relied on surveillance state apparatus, police state, to ensure compliance. So then when you're talking about destabilizing Western Europe, how far did that go and how successful were these groups?
Well, I think that we saw a lot of, fighting and strife in the 1980s between, leaders of the Green Movement, the nuclear freeze, which, the Soviets were involved with through their active measures. And then around the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you saw a lot of, neo-Nazi skinhead activities. And they kept on feeding off each other and going at each other. But one thing I might want to bring up about the Stasi is that when the Soviets took over the Eastern Zone, they used a lot of former Gestapo people and Nazis to start up the Stasi and start up their intimidation state.
But you're telling me that these allies of the Western countries, these wonderful people who were supposed to help us fight Nazism, who conquered, vanquished Nazi Germany, you're telling me that they were actually fostering Nazis for their own use? How's that possible?
Well, I mean, it's a sort of realpolitik. They'll do what they need to accomplish their goals. Both the West and the East, had their own Nazis. I mean, we wouldn't have gotten the moon without Nazis in the United States, nor the Soviets used the Nazis as their raw material to accomplish their goals in Eastern Germany. I mean, if you look at the uniforms that the East German army wore, they were basically Wehrmacht, and also, some Nazi generals were used by the Soviets.
So the Western links to the Nazis have been exposed in some of the recent literature on that subject, but these connections between the Soviet and communist affiliations with them and their joint cooperation on anti-Western geopolitical ambitions have not really been discussed, and that is probably what has lent a rather rosy views of both communist ideology in principle and the Soviet Union and its satellite states specifically. Now, it sounds to me like everything old is new again. We are hearing that you had the Soviet Union and Stasi's push the green and anti-nuclear free movements back in the day. All of a sudden, we are having a nuclear panic right now over Putin's alleged threat to allegedly use nukes if NATO starts imposes a nuclear no-fly zone in Ukraine or otherwise provides assistance to Ukrainian government. These techniques, these parallels, it seems to me that the same people have been using the same methods for decades, with no one being the wiser. How did this escape scrutiny? How did people not understand that Putin, KGB intelligence officer in Dresden responsible for those operations, was the same guy who came to power in the democratic liberal Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union?
I think there's just a lot of naivete, lack of sophistication among the academic foreign policy establishment and in the State Department. After the end of the Cold War, you had a lot of brain drain of people who understood this. Now, after President Reagan left office, the Berlin Wall fell, and people all of a sudden thought things changed. The thing is that people don't forget is that the KGB saved Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin in 1993 faced being ousted by his democratically elected rivals in the Russian parliament. But it was the KGB that came to his aid, and he empowered people like Boris Yeltsin, and Boris Yeltsin empowered people like Putin, and Putin, and the KGB ran things to the bank.
So we are seeing that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was far from the liberal dream that everyone has thought it to be. The ex-KGB pro-Nazi contingent has never been forced out of power. There's never been a clear transition between, the electorate and those who had controlled the money flow and so forth. You basically had a group of organized criminals, power grabbers, and assorted others who managed to gain control of newly privatized institutions and industries right after the fall. And there was never really a full democratization or liberalization of economics. You had the transition to crony control, I would say, not even real capitalism. And you have these former intelligence characters who came back to power, which they never fully left. And basically, the Yeltsin years were, kind of a confused transition period between one ideologically unsound period to another. So getting back to Putin and his links to Stasi and his links to these energy-related projects, just how much of it for Putin was ideology and commitment to the Soviet principles, and how much was he looking forward to a future where he could just exploit all of this, all the networks that he was personally building for his own use?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, Putin is about himself, about his own gain. I mean, he's somebody who's very vindictive. One of the things that he found after taking power was he was concerned about the lack of unity in Russia, exemplified by the Chechen problem. I mean, he looked to people like Alexander Dugin and his idea of, Slavophile nationalism, great Russian nationalism, the idea that Russia can't be great if it's not an empire, which is why we have the war in Ukraine, why we've had the Russian incursion into Georgia. And, Putin is also about rewarding those who have been loyal to him over time. I mean, the head of Gazprom is a guy who's been with him since the early 90s in St. Petersburg. So you have a clique, and this the St. Petersburg thing is connected to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation via something called the Petersburger Dialogue, which he set up with Gerhard Schroeder, the former German chancellor, to influence German policy. And you have two former Stasi members who are leaders of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation who are connected with this Putin entity.
So getting back to Schroeder now, he's been presented to the West as some typical rudderless Western sellout mercenary who's just ready to go anywhere for money, as he did with the Russian energy sector. But it sounds to me that his willingness to collaborate with former Stasi contingent may take him a step above that particular characterization and a step above some typical, Westerner politician looking for a lucrative business opportunity. Who was he exactly? Why was he willing to go as far as he did? Could he not get a job somewhere else?
Well, I mean, I can only speculate, but wouldn't be surprised if Putin gave him some sort of deal he couldn't refuse, and he's just very mercenary.
So basically, the greed of some of these politicians went as far as they were willing to collaborate with the very people who divided Germany, who weakened the country, and who basically turned it into a colony of the portions of the country into the colony of the Soviet Union. That to me seems rather catastrophic for the Germans themselves. Many of them don't seem to mind Schroeder's proclivities, but if you think about it, he is willing to sell out the country to the very people who once controlled it. So getting back to this Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, how did it become from this obscure, project, one of many, I'm sure, for this contingency, to this bridge between then and now, between Germany, Putin, and the United States? How did this come about, and how did it end up being so influential?
Well, the thing is that you've seen a great growing link on the American left toward internationalism, especially in the Democratic Socialists of America. And they used to be part of something called the Socialist International that included the Sandinistas and so forth. But they've become more and more influential due to people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and an influx of money. I mean, it's kind of interesting because 2012 is when the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation arrived in the United States. And in that same amount of time, we've seen the Democratic Socialists of America explode in size. I mean, they've been getting a lot of training, and I don't know about funding from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, but they're becoming more and more professional due to their connections with them. I mean, back in 2014, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation had a socialism conference in upstate New York among the topics was doing away with the Keystone XL pipeline and activism against it. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation funded a report that was co-funded by an office at Cornell University on how they could organize against the Keystone XL pipeline, which I found kind of interesting.
Why that particular pipeline, and who stood to gain the most from opposing it?
Well, that particular pipeline goes through the center of the U.S. from up in Alberta and Canada all the way down to Texas, and it runs through certain lands owned by Native American groups in South Dakota, which the leftists were able to bring together and coalesce. But one of the things that it does is it provides additional oil on the market, and these people want the Green New Deal. They want to eliminate fossil fuels, which makes us dependent on the Chinese.
So here's the question. You have significant financial considerations as a result of this pipeline being compromised by this environmental push. You have countries, not just private industries, losing out on huge income, resources, influence, you name it, as a result of the Keystone pipeline being potentially shut down as it was. How in all this time did these suspicious connections to foreign entities and to foreign agendas and to agendas that are quite frankly anti-American not reemerge at the time? Was there a concerted push to keep this down? How in all this time did this not float up?
Well, there has been some effort to bring this to the fore. The former Secretary of General Anders Fogh Rasmussen highlighted it in 2014. Congressman Randy Weber and Lamar Smith of the Science Committee highlighted this in 2017, and I worked with Congressman Weber on this particular investigation. But the thing is that you have a lot of very liberal, left-wing people in major news organizations that it's inconvenient for them. I mean, they were all too happy to say that President Trump was a Russian agent, and anybody who supported President Trump was a Russian agent, but they're not willing to look in the mirror and see how they've been duped by the Kremlin.
It sounds like this has been one of the most successful, longest-running active measure operations by the Kremlin in history. It's lasted decades, and it involved people who were at the very roots of this operation, now continuing it while being at the highest levels of power. How did they get as far as they did in terms of this being a sellable idea in the United States? How did the infiltration and penetration become quite so appealing to Americans?
Well, the thing is that the Soviets have and then the Russians penetrated our academic institutions and our elite institutions for up to 100 years. I mean, you didn't have like the 60s Marxist uprisings, come out of a vacuum. When you had the Soviet Comintern, that came into being after the Russian Revolution, that put its agents into universities, so like Columbia University in the United States, starting in maybe the 1930s, 1940s, they've practiced what they call United Front tactics, where they would abandon their outward communist rhetoric and so forth, and talk about how they were concerned about women, how they were concerned about, the environment, how they were concerned about race. So they would just simply use, language that sounded liberal and define their enemies as, fascists, when it's kind of funny because, they were the ones who were supporting fascists when it was convenient for them.
On the one hand, it sounds to me like the entire environmental movement, the entire energy efficiency movement has been hijacked by these foreign interests for their own personal, private agendas, not for the, world good, not even for some party, interest or ideology, but to make money. Because who stands to make money, the most money from all of it? Putin. When the US loses out on energy projects, when it's in a dependent position, Putin stands to gain directly. One example that you've mentioned in your article was the Nord Stream 2 project, which the entire time apparently was a Trojan horse. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, the Nord Stream pipelines, plural, you have the Nord Stream 1 pipeline that was completed, with President Barack Obama looking the other way in 2011, and you've had the Nord Stream 2. It's what they call, a way of political warfare, gray zone warfare to divide NATO. I mean, we've seen that in Ukraine because the Germans have been reticent against, forcibly providing arms and supplies for the Ukrainians. The person who was the head of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a former Stasi agent who, during the later years of East Germany, after the fall of the wall, he was the lawyer for and an advisor to Christa Luft, who is the economic minister of East Germany, who's now a leading person in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and for Hans Madro, the last East German premier, who is close to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation actually runs his foundation. And don't forget that Vladimir Putin awarded a friendship medal to Madro in 2017 for his lifetime of work.
So we are seeing that the project is directly linked to this, communist intelligence apparatus has been lauded, pushed, overlooked, and become and contributed to the current crisis and an act of aggression, an act of war by Russia in taking over Ukraine. In December, Senator Cruz of Texas stated clearly that Nord Stream 2 was the contributing factor to all of these things, and had the US applied the sanctions, that would at the very least have prevented Putin from moving forward quite so boldly. Part of his interest in Ukraine was entirely related to this, to energy projects, to pipelines, to gas transportation. Knowing that the US would not be imposing sanctions enabled him to make the decision to move forward with those plans. That raises a very disturbing question. To what extent has this administration and all of its various participants been aware that the Green New Deal and all of the component projects, far from stopping environmental damage and far from constraining all bad actors from pursuing particular energy lines, essentially weaponized and assisted Russia to the detriment of US interests in national security as much as in energy?
Well, I think that if you look at President Biden himself, he's been an appeaser of Russia and the Soviet Union his entire career. And back in 1975, Senator Biden told the Washington Post that the United States shouldn't be involved in anti-communist activities, outside U.S. borders. He appeased Leonid Brezhnev with the SALT II treaty, and that even President Carter backed away from in 1979. he opposed the deployment of Pershing 2 missiles to West Germany, which was a major goal of the Soviet-backed nuclear freeze movement. And I believe that, and then Vice President Biden, was all about appeasing Russia, after the Georgia invasion, with the Russia reset. So I think that they're either useful idiots or they're just plain incompetent. I mean, the Democrats in Congress removed the Republican led Science Committee report on Russian active measures in the environmental sector. So they have a willful blindness to this.
Now, it stands to reason that a lot of these progressive interests to gain financially from the implementation of these measures, even as Russia was gaining from them the most on a national level. By pushing particular industries and particular regulations, they made money off of it for the cronies who were involved in those businesses. And some of the green energy initiatives were clearly neither efficient nor particularly helpful to the environment, nor cheap or unaffordable for most of the US population. And yet they were being pushed as Russia continued gaining ground at US expense. I find it hard to believe that while embarking on these deals, none of these people could possibly foresee that Russia would profit from US cutting off its entire oil and gas market.
I think that what we have in America is a tendency to be one-dimensional thinking. Americans automatically assume that everything happens by chance. They don't understand about foundations, political organizing, and how things are moved. One of the ironies about Putin and anti-fracking is that they talk about how fracking poisons the water. Well, why is it that the environmental movement went and shut down all of the mines, or many of the mines in the United States that used to provide the rare earth metals needed to make these batteries that can't be recycled, that are incredibly toxic? So, and it's just kind of interesting that they don't want this stuff to happen here in the United States, but they don't have a problem if it happens elsewhere, and until recently in Russia.
I find it quite incredible that that as we are moving into this stage of aggression where Russia has used energy as a weapon against Europe and now increasingly against the United States, there has been dead silence from all these environmentalists who seemingly still have failed to realize that there is a direct connection between the US shutting down its own pipelines, lifting sanctions on Nord Stream, and Russia's ability to engage in acts of aggression against countries, starting with Ukraine, but also previously to that Georgia, Moldova, and potentially in the future NATO and other European states. Just how deep is the penetration? Are all these people really such useful idiots, or is this movement at this point controlled by Russian agents?
Well, I think that you have a lot of really useful idiots out there. I mean, if you look at the Twitter feeds, in response to Republicans raising these issues, well, they keep on saying, you guys are the Russian tools. So, we need green energy, to stop Putin and so forth. So they're incredibly naive. I have family members who think like this. I mean, they think that they're trying to save the world, save the environment. But the thing is that they rely on people who don't think beyond the slogan. Don't think outside the bumper sticker. But I mean, it's hard to tell, just how penetrated, Russian agents are in some of the more domestic things. But we can know one thing: the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is controlled by former Stasi people. It's the representative office in Moscow says in Russian that it supports the Russian agenda in Germany and by extension in the West. So we find the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation partnering with lots of far left groups like the Sunrise Movement, like the Democratic Socialists of America, that are out there in the streets causing problems.
What is the status of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in New York? Is it a registered FARA agent?
It is not. I looked into that, when I first started investigating the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I went to look at the Department of Justice's FARA database. There isn't any registration with under FARA, which which they should be because they're part of Die Linke, the left party in Germany.
How has this particular relatively obscure group become so prevalent, so influential, and has become such an important and visible partner of all these movements, parties, and organizations?
Well, I believe that you have a lot of people at the higher levels of these left-wing groups in the United States that are hardcore communists. If you look at their social media, and they look at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation's connection with the Far East German Communist Party as something positive, not as something to be pushed away from. I mean, like the Southern Poverty Law Center even supported the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and participated in one of its trainings in 2017. I mean, you find people for the American Way, they've been connected with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation also has an office in Beijing.
So, it's funny because one of the most common arguments in favor of communism, socialism, and other similar ideologies by all these people, no matter where they are, whether in Europe, the US, or anywhere on the planet, is that the real thing has not been tried yet, that the real thing has been brought about by corrupt, tyrannical individuals, and it's all in the past, it's history, and somehow we know better and we will do better. But if you look at it in practicality, the same people who perpetuated acts of brutality in Germany and the Soviet Union are now at the head of managing those very tasks. And either these people are not aware of the history of brutality of these individuals, or they simply don't care and are lying to themselves and others and are very happy to partner with them anyway. I don't know which one is more accurate, but regardless, this argument that somehow we can just start from scratch clearly does not really bear out in practice.
Well, I would agree it's probably the latter. They are so caught up in their ideology. Marxism is a religion. It's unfalsifiable. I mean, the true believers in Marxism are believe in it by means of faith. I mean, they have this idea, based on Hegel, about progress. That we will, by social change and so forth, perfect the human race at some point at the undefined future. So they seem to believe this, or try at least convince themselves. But if you look at who these people are and what they do once in power, they're kind of fooling themselves.
We are seeing right now a horrific price being paid by all involved as a result of these ideological proclivities mixed with greed and ambition by politicians, cronies, and other high level leaders of these movements who've used, the activists as their tool. We are seeing a war in Ukraine threatening the rest of to engulf the rest of Europe. We are seeing an energy crisis ongoing in Europe and a self-made energy crisis in the US, contributing to an ongoing inflation that predates the violent activity. We are seeing our relationships with our other allies deteriorating as a result of these decisions. We are seeing US contorting itself into a pretzel to fit its ideological agenda by going to Venezuela of all places and asking for gas initiatives. I realized that this is humorous and comical, and thankfully seems to have been rejected, or it simply did not work out. But the fact that this is even being contemplated is mind-boggling. So we are seeing all these catastrophic effects. I realized that a core of ideologues probably, was aiming for this precise example to subvert the US and undermine it and turn it into a weak country, isolated country that can have no influence, and somehow believes that Putin and whoever else are smarter, better, and should be managing world affairs instead of the US. But the majority of people, I don't think, share that sentiment at all. I think they've probably been duped. How are these major developments, these obvious complete and utter failures on every level, still not being picked up by the majority of the population that probably does not wish to live in an impoverished, communist state? And
well, I think there's a lot of censorship that happens. Our academic institutions put out brainwashed, idealists, who are given all these wonderful slogans, and they aren't told the downsides. They're told basically a candy covered rose colored glass view of what socialism is, as opposed to the real thing that imposes poverty, enslaves the populations that are ruled by it, that delivers as you stated earlier, terrible environmental impacts. I mean, look at China. It's the number one offender when it comes to environmental catastrophes. I mean, the Soviet Union was horrible. Eastern Europe was horrible. I mean, unless you have like some sort of market ethos or something like that, or you're a small, relatively homogeneous country like Sweden, it's not going to work for you.
so let's talk about the practical effects of your discoveries. Now that it's been revealed that the Nord Stream 2, founder is one of the coterie of Stasi agents who should have no credibility in the world at all by anybody ever, do you think this will in any way change things? Should this entire project not be completely discredited and shut down as a result of the fact of who's behind it ultimately?
Well, it should be shut down, but it's too late for the Germans, because they've already surrendered to Vladimir Putin and have become enslaved by Putin's energy. I mean, President Reagan said back in the early 1980s, when the first Soviet gas pipeline was put into France at the height of the Cold War, that was the Russian effort to control the West and to divide NATO. He was prophetic. People need to wake up, start raising awareness. People need to be made aware of what really is happening. I mean, unless people will become aware, we're not going to see anything happen. All we're going to have is the fat oligarchs, be all too happy to cater to Vladimir Putin once this war is over.
In terms of the United States, what do you think is going to happen next? Are there any next steps to undo this damage, to undo the network of manipulators and foreign agents that have been feeding the US lies not only for generations, but in particular gearing up to the current energy issue, current crisis with Ukraine, and so on and so forth?
Well, we can only hope. I mean, that when people have real things that impact their pocketbook, like the price of gasoline, that we'll see some changes in the midterm elections. As a result of my report, I now understand that some Republican members of Congress are moving forward to increase awareness and messaging of Putin's manipulation of the Green Movement.
And in terms of the Democratic Socialists of America and other such US-based movements, parties, and groups that have become disproportionately influential in recent years, how do you think these latest developments will affect them, if at all? Should they not also be discredited at the very least for their willingness to associate with such characters, or if nothing else?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we need to highlight the fact that they have no problem with partnering with the same people who built the Berlin Wall and the same people who turned East Germany into an open air gulag. I mean, what are we to think about them? I mean, we should be like questioning their motivations. They're also the same people who have supported the lockdowns as a result of COVID, the shredding of the First Amendment, the shredding of our ability to defend ourselves, from rioters and so forth. I mean, once they're fully consolidate their power, they will let go of all the pretenses to being democratic. They'll become as democratic as the German Democratic Republic.
Now, circling back, to quote our press secretary, to the issue of Antifa and neo-Nazis, and the fact that all these groups have actually been also agents or useful idiots for former Soviet operatives. What do we do now? Under the Biden administration, there's been an unprecedented push to examine and punish domestic terrorism, and the fact is, for whatever reason, many ordinary conservatives felt personally targeted. But here we have a real opportunity to expose foreign agents who've been fed Russian propaganda for decades and who have normally been fringe groups in the US with very little influence, and yet have been pushed as some pseudo-conservative outfit by the Biden administration. How do we deal with this issue, the fact that these groups, the Antifa and the neo-Nazis, who have been shown to be completely different, but in reality are one and the same and controlled by the same people, how do we put a stop to their activity and to their links to foreign agents, and how do we bring back the polarized American society from the brink of division, fed entirely by Russian propaganda, as it seems?
Well, I think that we need to be more vocal in terms of raising awareness of the Russian propaganda, of the connections of these groups to Russian agents and so forth, and working to raise awareness. I mean, the problem that we have now is the FBI, the CIA, and so forth have been taken over by people who believe this Russian propaganda. For crying out loud, John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, was a supporter of the Communist Party USA while it was fully controlled and funded by the Kremlin.
We have had agents of influence for for Russia at this point, and for the Soviet Union, and for communist agendas on essentially anti-American power hungry warmongers for decades. So it seems so they don't need to hide. They need to be, secreting away as moles in the bowels of intelligence agencies. They are out there completely open about their affiliations, and that has stopped being shameful. At the same time, we are seeing a lot of the Russian propaganda points being adopted as contrarianism against leftist overreach. How do we prevent any sort of foreign influence from taking advantage of our internal problems?
Well, I think that it's a it's a really big problem. I mean, it's something that I wish I had an answer. I mean, we find conservatives now with the Ukraine situation pushing Kremlin narratives, and then we find people on the left pushing Kremlin narratives. I mean, I think it comes down to education and awareness raising. That they talk about like NATO expansion. I mean, when I hear stuff about that, it's kind of like talking about you know uh, closing the barn door after the cow has escaped. We need to work on dealing where we're at now, focusing on exposing what the Russians are up to now, focusing on their the messaging, and on providing a counter narrative that focuses on what is best for all Americans, not one particular group versus the other. I mean, if you go back, this whole like black versus white stuff, it's something that runs very deep. But the Soviets, were saw that they could manipulate it going back to the 1920s. I mean, Manning Johnson, who was a former Communist Party member, highlighted in the 1950s, 1960s that the communists had no interest in helping Black Americans, but they wanted to destroy this country. And I think the focus on American patriotism, focus on doing what we can to be best for all Americans, not just for certain groups.
I'm afraid that identity politics and kind of victimhood narrative for increasingly micro victim groups has become so prevalent that that type of thinking is going to take a lot of time to undo with more positive reframing of these of hardships and dealing with resolving
Well,
problems. But at the end of the day, it has to be done for our survival. Otherwise, people like Putin who feed on divisions will prevail.
well, social media has been a major purveyor of this siloing. It used to be that we all watch the same news. We all, listen to the same music. But with the advent of the internet, you can choose who you're going to associate. You and I can choose that we're just going to associate with each other. We don't have to associate with people outside our little mind silos, and the same with the people on the far left. So we don't talk to each other anymore. I mean, we need to start like working one person at a time, talking to neighbors in the real world.
Absolutely, absolutely. We can, freedom of association is a wonderful thing that should be protected, but intellectual curiosity, intellectual openness, and willingness to listen to others is just as important. In combination with that, we cannot make wise choices of associations if we don't even know who is out there and what we really want to choose. What what is your next step in this investigation, and what do you think about the future of US energy given this state of affairs?
Well, the next step in my investigation is to start looking at some of the organizations that the congressional committee had suspected of being involved in supporting Russian narratives and so forth, to see if they have ties with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in any way, shape, or form, because it's the clearest example of a Russian active measures operation, because we know who the people are. We know how they're connected to the Russians. We know that they've pledged their allegiance to Moscow. So it's a matter of exposing those people, and also raising awareness that this green energy isn't so green.
I agree completely. There are many initiatives out there that lack funding, that lack support, precisely because the US government and assorted institutions have meddled into the market to the benefit of Russians, and essentially shut down the possibility of initiatives on energy efficiency that could be better, could provide a win-win for all, instead of empowering US enemies. Unfortunately, we have a bigger problem to contend with, which is the fact that the US government has become weaponized by Russia, by Beijing at this point. But this has been a great start to breaking down something that should have been on the forefront of discussions decades ago. And we've gone so far that now it's very obvious that the Cold War has never been over, that the same people plotted and fostered the connections in the shadows and out of the shadows, in broad daylight, actually, unbeknownst to us, while we were distracted by the slogans of the day. And now the Cold War is coming back to haunt us full throttle, and we're not prepared at all.
Well, I would definitely agree with you. I think that for me, the most important thing was working to find that the old KGB networks in the United States never evaporated. I mean, Angela Davis personifies it, because she was close to Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, who was the father of modern neo-Marxist critical theory, among others. She was supported by the Soviet Union, received the Lenin Peace Prize in 1979. She was close to the East Germans, and attended one of their training schools near Berlin, where she met Yasser Arafat. And she's one of the most influential people on the far left today. I mean, Ilhan Omar looks up to her. So there's a lot of the far leftists, but she's always been a Russian propagandist.
Indeed, a lot of the destructive movements and ideological streams that we're seeing today have been affected intellectually by Russian propaganda, which is what the Soviet intelligence did the best: active measures, divisions, and poisonous disinformation. Unfortunately, this is something that we have to fight back with better ideas, better solutions, and rebuilding the society from this miasma of foreign intelligence meddling. Thank you so much for joining the Washington Outsider today, and for bringing this valuable perspective on issues that have been basically a mystery to us all. We are seeing the results of it. We could have many natural allies in the fight against something that no one really wants. We had allies in the Cold War in the Arab world, which have now become distanced from us by our own destructive decision-making, polarization. All of that is the work of Russian and Chinese propaganda machinery, because they stand to gain the most from US being weak, divided, isolated, and from losing its allies to them. They're busy recruiting our allies, while we're pushing everybody around us away in searching for and running to our enemies like Iran and Venezuela. I hope this changes. I hope what you revealed today will start a process of moving away and really fighting back and taking back the control of our own future from our enemies. And I look forward to the journey as well. I look forward to hearing more about your investigation as it progresses.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this was the Washington Outsider. Stay tuned for future programs coming up shortly.